I've always felt that the Beatles are all about love and peace. I mean, in their songs, their music, and in their interviews. And they do believe in the love you take is equal to the love you make. And, I just enjoyed being here, giving back to them, as much as possible. And they're giving back to us with the release of Anthology 4. But back in 1995, they gave us Anthology 1, 2, and 3. Because I guess that George Martin, the Beatles, everybody felt like the world was ready for this right now. It was like perfect timing, according to them, 1995. And I found this press conference that was attended by Neil Aspinall, George Martin, Jeff Lynne, and Derek Taylor, and Rupert Perry of EMI. Rupert Perry did not get any questions. He was the one panelist who didn't get any questions at this press conference that was held November 20th, 1995. It was for the release of Anthology 1 and the single Free as a Bird. There were 400 journalists there. But I'm telling you, when I saw this, and I listened to this press conference, I think probably about 8 or 10 times. And each time I'm just like shaking my head and go like, what is going on? What are with these dumb questions? I just do not understand it. Some of them were good, okay? But it really was like a sign of the times. Back in 1995, I guess everybody was thinking, oh, you know what, the Beatles, we know all the records, we know everything, they're old, whatever. It's like not a big deal. Of course, except, the fans, okay? The fandom, spread out all over the world. We love the Beatles. We were looking forward to it, etc. But, maybe I think these days we're looking forward a lot more because I do think the fandom is a lot bigger. But back then, I don't know how big it was. But the Anthology 1, 2, and 3, the original Anthology, that grew the fandom. It really was pivotal to grow and maintain the Beatles' legacy. It was just a watershed moment. But this press conference, I was sitting there, what am I seeing? What am I listening to here? Because the journalists, really dumb questions. Just like back in the day, the original press conferences that the Beatles were holding, some of those questions were really dumb, and the Beatles just kind of had to grin and bear it and shake their head, and whatever. Okay, here's another dumb question. Very similar here in 1995. Some of the questions were okay, though, okay? But really, seriously, they kind of want some of the first questions were like, okay, where are the Beatles? Where are they right now? Where's Paul, George, and Ringo? And Derek goes, well, they're anywhere but here. They're home. Who knows? Another question was, are there any messages in the album from the Beatles? Because I guess he's referring to some of the supposedly subliminal messages, from the 60s, that the Beatles might have put in their album. That's probably what he was referring to. But then Derek basically says, hey, the messages from the Beatles, as ever, was ideally peace on earth, goodwill to men and women. So yeah, the Beatles have always been about love and peace, man, okay? And then there were a few questions that were trying to pick a fights, okay? Like trying to talk about maybe a potential rivalry between Jeff Lynne and George Martin, and even George Harrison and Paul McCartney. So watch the interview. I'll put a link in there so you can kind of watch that. It's in the beginning and it just kind of goes by and everybody just kind of basically ignores it. But then there were a couple of, very interesting ones where one of the questions was like to George Martin, how do you feel about Jeff Lynne being involved and, producing, because Jeff Lynne produced Free as a Bird and George Martin produced the Anthology. And so, George Martin says, hey, man, I got to work on the big one, and that's the one that I wanted. But now that I'm hearing Free as a Bird, I wished I'd produced it because it's probably going to be a number one, and it would have rounded me out. I would have had my 30th number one, and I like round numbers. So George is trying to be very charming here and trying to just, deflect any of these reporters trying to cause strife here with this team. This is a team. They all love each other. They all have the same goal of, promoting the Beatles' legacy and promoting love and peace and the music and beauty. And they're all up here, and the journalists are all just down here. And they're just going to stay up here. We're not going in the mud down here with them. And then there's another question here. I think there's a few good ones like this one. One of the reporters asked, like, hey, we've always heard that, they've released all the good stuff. There's just nothing else to release right now. So are we going to be hearing some good things? And why release everything right now? Well, Derek has sort of like a flowery type of an answer, and he compares the Beatles' works to like old manuscripts. Like old books, they have this certain patina. After so many years and decades, maybe even centuries, you have this old book, and they have those colored. The pages are a little bit stained, maybe a few little holes in them, and so they grow in value over the years, and especially with the Beatles, now that they're famous, now that they're probably even more valuable, and it could be like a very fascinating thing. Okay. So, but George Martin, he has a more straightforward, like down to earth, in your face, it's the Beatles, man, type of an answer. And George says like, and I've tried to transcribe this. It's probably not perfect, but George says like, all the years I've produced the Beatles, 1962 onwards, my aim was to present them as best as they possibly could. Every track we did, we took great deal of care, and we said, this has got to be absolutely the best. And we rejected anything that wasn't 100% in that way. So looking back on it this past year and listening to every song we ever did and every take of every song and every track, and when you get to that kind of minute examination, you realize, first of all, you are reliving history and reliving your own life as well. And you realize that maybe I wasn't right. Maybe, in fact, some of those early takes which we worked on and honed, some of them had a charm. I know they had mistakes in them. They had little wobbly bits now and again. Some of them are actually gorgeous. And listening to them again, I've been enthralled to realize what we had there. And so I thought, well, let's present to the people what we did. And in the raw, it's warts and all. And you got mistakes there. You've got funny little things happening, but it's honest. And it's what we did. And you hear us talking, you hear the boys commenting, you hear them breaking down and so on. We are a fly on the wall, listening to the Beatles. And I think it's interesting. And I think most people are ready for it now. They wouldn't have been ready for it in 1970 or 1980. But now that all that time has gone past, we can be reflective about it. We can look back on a bit of history. And I think that's what we're doing. Then there's another question that I really like George's answer to. Okay. So the question is basically like a three-parter. It says, hey, did they ask the questions of like Jeff, Lynne, and George, did they hear the John's cassette together for the first time? Will it be a number one? Will Free as a Bird be a number one for Christmas? And would George have done anything different from Jeff if he'd produced it? And would John approve of everything they were producing? And Jeff basically says, hey, I hope John approves it. We did everything with love and care. And then George once again gets in their face and says, hey, I don't like these what if questions. Okay, I just don't like it. And of course, I probably would have done it differently because I'm different from Jeff. It doesn't mean it would have been better or worse, just different. And then he skips over to like, would John approve, that part of the question? And again, he says, hey, I just don't like these what ifs. Okay, now would John approve? Like, who's to say? Because that is another what if question. John would change his mind more often than he changes socks. And if he were in the right mood, he would have said, great, gear, fantastic, fab. But on any other one, would have sagged it off. I don't know. The very fact that Yoko gave the track to Paul with her blessing, and she was closest of all to John in the end, it was an indication that she thought John would have liked it. It's perfect. It's the perfect answer there, just kind of putting everybody in their place, saying, hey, man, this is what Yoko wanted for John, and she should know. So that kind of settles that right there. And it also kind of shows how close George was to John and how much he knew John. But he's still not going to speak for John. So smart, because, that's not how you do it. You don't speak for the Beatles. Let them speak for themselves, or let the wives speak for their husbands. And there was a funny follow-up question to that when one of the reporters asked, hey, do you think Yoko has anything left in her bottom drawer? And then Neil Aspinall just speaks up pretty quickly and says, hey, I have no idea what Yoko's got in her bottom drawer. Everybody laughs. So you got to see that. You got to watch that video just for that, basically. It was perfect. And not, so here's Neil Aspinall sitting there. Solid gold. Neil just does not like the spotlight, but there he is. And they didn't really ask Neil anything except one dumb question. And that one dumb question to Neil Aspinall was, how do you like the Beatles music? Are you a fan? And all Neil has to say, what Neil said was, yeah, I really like their music. I've always really liked it. Ever since they first came back from Hamburg. That was it, man. It's just a waste of Neil Aspinall's time. I'm just like really, really sorry. Then there is another question that I think is kind of interesting, and it also kind of illustrates how, where the reporters were, how they really were almost looking down on the whole thing. The question was like, hey man, like, why is this press conference such a deal? Why is this release such a big deal? It's just a pop record release. And Derek basically says, hey, I just don't take anything seriously anymore. But then George, once again, right in the face and right to the point, and basically says, hey man, I take everything seriously. And then he kind of laughs a little bit and he says, no, I don't take this too seriously, but it is important. And people do like Beatles music and they enjoy it. And then he goes on to say that, when you add up all the joy that those four people have given, the Beatles have given everyone, given the world every day, every month, every year since 1962, I take that seriously. And I think it's great. I mean, yes, thank you. Thank you, George. Like, smack him on the head, man. You do take the Beatles seriously. This is serious. So these, the journalists just do not, most of them probably, did not know where everything was at. And then there's a little bit of a follow-up question here where it says one of the reporters asked, hey, did you know that everything was going to go on this long? And do you think it'll go into the next century, meaning the 2000th century that we're in right now? And was it really just more than pop music? So they're really still kind of digging at this. Really, is it really this serious? Is this really such a big deal? Once again, George steps up and is very charming and straight to the point, says, hey, George says, hey, I'm biased, and each generation is going to find the Beatles anew. And he's seen it in his own family, and we've seen that video where George Martin is talking to his grandchild about the Beatles. It's absolutely fabulous. And that's how it is. You hand down the Beatles to the next generation. So here is George Martin handing down the Beatles to all of us right now. God, I just love him so much. And he says, like, they were unique. They were basically, like a one-off. They were great songwriters. They were great composers, and they were great performers. And you just don't get that. And you're just never, ever going to get that again. Oh my God. And after I'd watched this press conference and listened to it so many times, I really got the vibe that, George knew these guys intimately and he loved them and he was representing them. He was fighting for them, fighting for their legacy, fighting for the music, fighting for them to be taken seriously, because he loved them. It was like he was a part of the family. And I'm sitting there and saying to myself, and I don't like saying it, because I don't like labeling anybody the fifth Beatle necessarily. But he really was in that moment like the fifth Beatle because he knew them. And the Beatles weren't there. John definitely wasn't there in 1995. But he was in that room standing up for all of them, fighting them. And being just as feisty as John, Paul, George, and Ringo would have been to, idiot journalists, okay? And because he'd been in that room and from 1962 on, worked with them, was right there every moment, every step of the way, just invested. Well, not every moment. I'm being a little bit, hyperbolic here. But he did go back and he listened to all the tapes, all the outtracks. So he relived it. He was just flooded with all the memories, flooded with all that love and the joy and the good times. And he's just steeped in it right then and there. And you could just tell and feel it. George was just sitting there. Hey, man, like, this is the Beatles. This is their life and their legacy. What's wrong with you? It's like, do you understand what they're giving you? Do you understand the legacy here? Yeah, this is important. It would be great if George Martin were here right now and representing the Beatles again for Anthology 4. It would just be a delight. He would be so much fun, and I would just, I would just love to have all of them here again. I mean, what am I saying? But we can't. So I'm at least glad that we have the music, we have their legacy, and and I'm just a loving fan, and I appreciate everything that they give us. I don't want George to be yelling at me because I don't appreciate the Beatles and I don't love the Beatles, because, yeah, I do take them seriously. I take my love for them very seriously. Thank you for being here with me. I really appreciate it. And until next time, peace and love one another. Take care. But George is talking basically their language with authority, like really leaning in. And these journalists probably don't appreciate or realize that George is probably saying, "You flippin' idiots. Okay, what the heck is wrong with you, man?" Okay, they don't realize that is dripping from every syllable. And all the other guys like Jeff Lynne and Neil Aspinall and Derek Taylor, I'm sure that they've all got, that smile plastered on their faces, when they're listening to, but also kind of going like that too, to the reporters.